Imagine waking up inside a stone castle where even the king smells like a damp goat, not because he forgot to shower, because, according to many of the smartest people alive at the time, taking too many baths might actually make you sick. Now imagine that the queen beside him owns gowns embroidered with gold, pearls worth entire villages, and enough velvet to decorate a cathedral. Yet she has probably been wearing the same linen undergarment for several days. Somewhere beneath all those expensive layers is a generous mixture of sweat, smoke from fireplaces, horse odor, candle wax, stale perfume, and whatever happened during yesterday's dinner. Meanwhile, outside the castle walls, an ordinary peasant is sharing a single-room cottage with children, chickens, pigs, maybe a sleepy cow, and a dog that has absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. The floor is dirt. The air is thick with smoke because the fire never really goes out. The nearest toilet is, well, wherever everyone has quietly agreed not to stand. And somehow, despite all this, people genuinely believed they were living quite normally. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where soap existed but wasn't always trusted. Perfume was expected to fight battles it had no chance of winning. Lice were practically permanent roommates, and everyone, from beggars to bishops, was doing their very best with an understanding of hygiene that occasionally felt like it had been invented during a particularly confusing dream. Oddly enough, medieval people weren't stupid. They simply understood cleanliness through a completely different lens. And that's somehow even more fascinating. So, hey guys, tonight we begin with the disgusting reality of medieval hygiene. Dim the lights a little. Find a comfortable spot you've been pretending isn't actually your favorite. Maybe pull a blanket over yourself. Let your shoulders relax. Let the day quietly drift away. We're not here to judge anyone who lived 800 years ago. After all, they didn't have hot showers. They didn't have antibacterial soap. They certainly didn't have internet strangers explaining why everyone should wash their hands for 20 seconds. Instead, they had tradition, religion, ancient medical theories, a remarkable amount of optimism, and enough body odor to make modern elevators seem positively luxurious. So settle in. We'll wander slowly through muddy streets, smoky castles, crowded monasteries, noisy marketplaces, and royal bedrooms where things were far less glamorous than paintings would later suggest. No rushing, no dramatic battles, just a gentle journey into one of history's least fragrant centuries. One of the biggest surprises about medieval hygiene is that people actually cared about being clean. That's worth repeating because popular culture has convinced many of us that everyone simply rolled around in mud until the Renaissance arrived carrying a bar of soap. Reality is much more interesting. Cleanliness meant different things. For many Europeans, especially during the High Middle Ages, washing your face each morning was considered perfectly respectable. Hands were washed before meals whenever water was available. Guests at noble banquets were often offered bowls of water so they could clean their hands before touching food. Considering forks weren't widely used in many regions, this made excellent practical sense. Nobody particularly wanted greasy fingerprints on their roasted chicken, or someone else's. Linen clothing also played an important role. Outer garments weren't washed very often because expensive wool and dyed fabrics could be difficult to clean. Instead, people relied on lightweight linen, shirts worn directly against the skin. These absorbed sweat and body oils. Changing the linen was often viewed as almost as effective as washing the body itself. It's actually a surprisingly clever system. If washing large wool garments is difficult, wash the cheaper layer underneath instead. Problem partially solved. Of course, only if you own multiple linen shirts. Poorer families usually did not, which meant laundry day wasn't exactly a daily luxury. Soap itself wasn't some magical future invention waiting patiently. In Victorian England, medieval soap already existed. Recipes varied. Many combined animal fat, with ashes rich in alkaline substances. Some Mediterranean regions produced excellent olive oil soaps that were softer and more pleasant than rough northern varieties. Certain cities even developed reputations for quality soap making. It wasn't especially luxurious, but it worked, at least most of the time. Unfortunately, soap alone couldn't overcome several much larger problems. Like water. Clean water was precious. Urban rivers often doubled as garbage dumps. Animals wandered freely. Waste from homes frequently found its way into nearby streams. Industrial workshops dumped dyes, chemicals, and tanning waste into the same water people might later collect. Nobody had municipal treatment plants. Nobody was checking bacterial levels. Nobody even knew bacteria existed. As far as medieval medicine understood things, illness usually came from an imbalance inside the body or from unhealthy air known as miasma. Bad smells suggested danger. They weren't completely wrong. Rotting waste often does accompany disease. They simply misunderstood why. Instead of invisible microorganisms, the smell itself became suspicious. That's an understandable mistake if nobody owns a microscope for another several centuries. Because if something smells terrible, surely that's what makes people ill. Reasonable enough, just not entirely correct. This way of thinking shaped nearly everything. Fresh air became extremely important. Sweet herbs were carried in little bags. Flowers decorated rooms. Churches burned incense. Wealthy households scattered fragrant plants across stone floors. Not simply because they enjoyed pleasant aromas. They believed these pleasant smells actively protected health. Imagine trying to defeat disease with lavender. It's oddly charming. Also completely impossible. Still, it must have made the room smell considerably nicer. At least until the dog wandered in. Now bathing. Ah yes, the famous medieval bath. Or perhaps the famous lack of one. This is where modern myths become especially tangled. Early medieval Europe actually inherited bathing traditions from the Romans. Roman bathhouses had once been enormous social centers. Some continued operating after the Western Roman Empire declined. In many towns, public baths survived for centuries. People visited them for washing, conversation, relaxation, business meetings. Occasionally gossip that probably ruined somebody's afternoon. Bathhouses could be lively places. Men and women sometimes used them separately, sometimes together, depending on local customs. Food might even be served. If this sounds suspiciously like a medieval spa, you're not entirely wrong. But things gradually changed. Several factors contributed. Maintaining large heated baths required money, fuel, organization, political stability. Not always easy during periods of warfare or economic decline. Religious leaders occasionally worried that mixed bathing encouraged inappropriate behavior. Some bathhouses gained reputations that were, let's politely call them socially adventurous, because humans remain wonderfully predictable across every century. If there's a public place where people gather wearing very little, someone will eventually make poor decisions. Later, outbreaks of disease complicated matters even further. By the late Middle Ages, especially after plague epidemics, some physicians argued that hot baths open the pores, allowing illness easier access into the body. Again, perfectly logical according to their medical theory, completely backwards according to ours. So bathing never disappeared. It simply became less universally encouraged in some places and during certain periods. People still washed, just not always by soaking their entire bodies. Instead, they relied heavily on partial washing. Face, hands, feet, perhaps the neck, the visible parts, the socially important parts. Everything hidden beneath 6 layers of clothing, well, that could wait. Fortunately for everyone involved, almost everyone else was making exactly the same decision, which probably reduced embarrassment considerably. Let's float over to another royal disaster, because kings and queens were not magically cleaner than everyone else. Royal households certainly possess advantages. Private servants, fresh linens, imported perfumes, occasionally elaborate bathing equipment. But they also traveled constantly. Roads were filthy. Castles were drafty. Heating enormous tubs required tremendous effort. Imagine asking servants to carry bucket after bucket of hot water upstairs simply because you like a relaxing evening. Possible? Yes. Convenient? Not remotely. Even royalty had practical limits. Perfume therefore became an important companion. Rose water, lavender, rosemary, sage, mint, various aromatic oils. These didn't replace washing. They simply helped, or attempted to help, sometimes heroically, sometimes hopelessly. One suspects that after 3 days riding through muddy countryside surrounded by horses, no amount of rosewater was winning that particular battle. Still, hope is admirable, even scented hope. The medieval bedroom itself might surprise you. Beds were expensive, really expensive. Mattresses often contained straw, feathers, wool, or plant fibers. Curtains surrounded the bed, not merely for decoration, but for warmth. Bedrooms remained cold. Stone walls have very little sympathy. Fireplaces heated rooms unevenly. Heavy curtains trapped precious warmth. Unfortunately, warm enclosed spaces also appeal to insects. Bed bugs found these arrangements delightful. Fleas enthusiastically agreed. Lice rarely complained either. Medieval people spent enormous effort trying to manage these unwelcome companions. They combed their hair carefully. They washed clothing when possible. They aired bedding. They used herbs believed to discourage insects. Sometimes it even worked. Sometimes the fleas simply relocated a few inches. History can be disappointingly realistic like that. Imagine finishing hours of careful grooming only for a determined flea to immediately undo all your emotional progress. Not exactly an inspiring morning. Hair itself received considerable attention. Contrary to popular imagination, medieval hairstyles could be surprisingly elaborate. Women brushed long hair carefully. Men trimmed beards according to fashion. Barbers became important professionals. In fact, the medieval barber did far more than cut hair. He might also pull teeth, treat wounds, perform minor surgery. Because apparently if someone can trim your beard, perhaps they can also remove a suspicious lump. Medical specialization had not yet become especially fashionable. It certainly kept appointments interesting. I came for a haircut and left missing a tooth. Quite the afternoon. Dental hygiene existed too, although perhaps not as comfortably as ours. People cleaned teeth using rough cloths, twigs, herbs, or powder mixtures containing ingredients like charcoal, salt, or crushed plants. Some recipes sound sensible. Others sound like enthusiastic guesses. Tooth decay remained common. Sugar wasn't yet consumed in the astonishing quantities familiar today, which helped somewhat, but nutrition varied. Dental care remained limited, and once pain began, well, let's simply say medieval dentistry rewarded courage or resignation, sometimes both. Yet despite everything we've talked about tonight, despite smoke-filled homes, shared living spaces, questionable plumbing, and armies of determined fleas, life simply continued. People laughed, married, worked, raised children, argued with neighbors, complained about taxes, celebrated holidays, worried about tomorrow's weather, exactly as people always have, because normal is remarkably flexible. What seems unimaginable to us felt completely ordinary to them. And perhaps, if we suddenly woke up in their world, after enough months, it might begin to feel ordinary to us as well. A slightly smellier version of ordinary, but ordinary nonetheless. And that's perhaps the strangest truth of all. To medieval people, they weren't living inside history. They were simply living, one smoky morning at a time. The morning usually began long before anyone felt particularly enthusiastic about it. Not because medieval people were unusually disciplined, but because the sun had made the decision for them. Without electric lights, without alarm clocks, and certainly without the luxury of scrolling through a phone for another just 5 minutes, the rhythm of life followed daylight. In winter, people clung to warmth for as long as possible. In summer, work often started astonishingly early, and before anyone thought about breakfast, there was the smell, not one smell, thousands of them, with smoke drifting through tiny cottages. Wet earth, fresh manure, yesterday's cooking, damp while hanging near the fire, the unmistakable scent of livestock who, quite frankly, had every intention of spending the day exactly where they pleased. To modern noses, it would probably feel overwhelming. To medieval noses, it was simply Tuesday. One of the biggest misunderstandings about medieval villages is imagining them as permanently coated in knee-deep mud, with everyone constantly slipping into puddles while chickens watched judgmentally. Reality was a little less dramatic. Roads certainly became muddy after rain. Many streets remained unpaved. Drainage was inconsistent, but people weren't intentionally living in filth. Whenever possible, communities repaired roads, laid gravel, dug ditches, and tried to keep pathways usable. Keyword, tried. Nature occasionally had other ideas. A single week of heavy rain could undo months of careful work. Ox carts carved deep ruts into soft ground. Horses churned wet earth into something resembling thick soup. Every passing wagon generously redistributed the problem. By the end of autumn, some roads looked less like transportation routes and more like experiments in advanced mud engineering. Good boots became incredibly valuable. Good boots also wore out quickly, because medieval roads had absolutely no interest in preserving expensive footwear. And if your boots failed, congratulations. You now had direct contact with several centuries of agricultural reality. Fortunately, most people accepted this with remarkable calm. When everyone has muddy feet, nobody is particularly embarrassed about muddy feet. The cottage itself offered both shelter and challenges. Most ordinary families lived in surprisingly small spaces. One room was common, perhaps two, if the household enjoyed unusual prosperity. Several people slept together, partly for warmth and partly because there simply wasn't much room to spread out. Privacy existed in theory. In practice, not so much. Children, grandparents, parents, and sometimes hired workers all shared the same living area. Conversations became everyone's business, whether they wished them to be or not. The fire sat at the heart of everything. It cooked meals, provided warmth, dried clothing, produced light, and filled the house with smoke. Even cottages with chimneys often remained smoky because ventilation was imperfect. Older homes sometimes allowed smoke to escape through simple roof openings. That worked, eventually. Until then, everyone inhaled a generous helping with smoke every single day. Their eyes watered. Their clothes absorbed the smell. The rafters gradually darkened with soot. If you've ever sat beside a campfire and discovered your jacket still smelled smoky 3 days later, you experienced a tiny glimpse of medieval fashion. Except imagine never really escaping it. Smoke became part of life, along with the occasional tearful attempt to cook dinner while blinking furiously. Now, let's talk about the animals, because they were absolutely everywhere. Today, many people separate human living spaces from animal spaces. The medieval world often found this distinction unnecessarily complicated. A family's greatest wealth might be its cow, or a few pigs, or several chickens. Leaving them outside during harsh weather-invited theft, predators, or illness, bringing them closer, offered protection. So yes, animals frequently lived remarkably close to people, sometimes in adjoining sections of the house, sometimes beneath elevated sleeping areas, sometimes wandering in and out with the confidence of creatures who clearly believed they paid rent. The chickens certainly behaved that way. Pigs were intelligent enough to become surprisingly adventurous. Dogs drifted wherever scraps appeared. Cats enjoyed the highest level of independence imaginable. No one truly owned the cat. The cat merely tolerated human assistance. Rodents, unfortunately, appreciated these arrangements just as much. Where grain existed, mice arrived. Where mice gathered, cats found employment. Where food accumulated, everything else eventually appeared too. The medieval household was a carefully balanced ecosystem held together by determination and several hopeful assumptions. Cleaning was therefore constant. Sweeping happened regularly. Ashes were removed. Food scraps discarded. Fresh straw added when old bedding became unpleasant. People worked continuously to stop disorder from completely taking over. The problem wasn't laziness. The problem was that dirt never stopped arriving. Imagine cleaning a floor while farm animals periodically wander across it. You begin to understand the challenge. Water made everything more complicated. Fetching it required time. A nearby well was a blessing. A distant stream meant multiple exhausting trips carrying heavy buckets. Water wasn't something casually wasted. Every bucket represented labor. Every splash had value. Families prioritized drinking, cooking, and essential washing first. Luxuries came later, if they came at all. Children often helped with these daily tasks from remarkably young ages, not because medieval parents lacked affection, but because every pair of hands genuinely mattered A 7-year-old carrying water contributed something meaningful to the survival of the household. Life required cooperation. There simply wasn't another option. Meals also reflected the realities of hygiene. Hands were washed before eating, whenever practical. Bread often served as both food and plate. Knives appeared more commonly than forks. Shared bowls weren't unusual. Neither was sharing drinking vessels among family members. By modern public health standards, perhaps not ideal. By medieval standards, entirely ordinary. Nobody paused dinner to wonder about microscopic organisms. Those wouldn't become part of scientific conversation for centuries. Instead, visible cleanliness mattered. If your hands looked reasonably clean, good enough, the invisible world remained invisible, which, admittedly, made it difficult to worry about. Let's float gently from the cottage to the medieval marketplace. Because if villages smelled lively, markets smelled ambitious. Imagine hundreds of people arriving before sunrise. Farmers with vegetables, butchers with fresh meat, fish sellers hoping customers purchased everything before the afternoon heat, bakers carrying warm loaves, cheese makers, potters, blacksmiths, merchants, pilgrims, travelers, children running exactly where adults wish they wouldn't. Add horses, oxen, dogs, occasionally geese who seemed personally offended by everyone's existence. Now combine all those smells beneath a warm summer sun. It's memorable. Markets were noisy, colorful, and surprisingly energetic. Authorities often established rules about waste disposal because everyone understood that cleanliness affected trade. No one wanted to purchase expensive cloth while standing ankle-deep in yesterday's fish remains. Unfortunately, enforcing regulations proved considerably harder than writing them down. Some merchants behaved responsibly. Others displayed remarkable creativity when interpreting the rules. Human nature has always enjoyed searching for loopholes. Fresh meat posed particular challenges. Without refrigeration, timing mattered enormously. Animals were typically slaughtered shortly before sale. Customers preferred freshness. Officials inspected markets in many towns. Spoiled food threatened both health and public confidence. Again, people absolutely cared about cleanliness. They simply operated with limited technology. You can only preserve meat so effectively when electricity remains several hundred years away. The butcher did his best. The weather occasionally refused to cooperate. Meanwhile, fish sellers fought an even more determined battle against time, especially inland. One suspects customers learned to identify very fresh, reasonably fresh, and perhaps let's buy the cheese instead. Cheese, fortunately, generally complain less. Medieval clothing also deserves another look. People rarely owned enormous wardrobes. Even prosperous families possessed far fewer garments than modern households. Each item represented considerable labor. Spinning thread, weaving cloth, cutting, sewing, repairing. Clothing lasted because replacing it proved expensive. Tiers were patched, sleeves altered, buttons reused. Nothing disappeared simply because fashion changed slightly. Laundry therefore became serious business. Linen undergarments received frequent attention whenever possible. Outerwool garments, much less so, will dislike constant washing. It shrank, lost shape, required careful handling. Instead, people brushed clothing vigorously to remove dirt. They aired garments outdoors. Sunlight helped. Fresh breezes helped. Neither eliminated every odor, but they certainly improved matters. Sometimes that's all anyone could realistically ask. The wealthy occasionally scented clothing with herbs stored in chests. Lavender remained popular. Rosemary appeared frequently. Cedar would help discourage insects. These methods actually offered genuine benefits. Not magical ones, but practical ones. The chest smelled pleasant. The clothing smelled pleasant. Everyone involved appreciated the effort, except perhaps the moths, who had developed entirely different priorities. Speaking of insects, let's return briefly to lice, because ignoring them would give an unfairly optimistic picture. Head lice appeared across nearly every social class. Kings, queens, monks, merchants, peasants, children. Nobody received automatic immunity. through noble birth. Regular combing became essential. Fine-toothed combs recovered by archaeologists demonstrate how important grooming remained. Finding lice wasn't necessarily viewed as a shocking personal failure. It was viewed as an irritating reality, rather like discovering weeds in a garden. Annoying, persistent, entirely expected. Friends and family often helped remove them, an oddly intimate act by modern standards, completely ordinary by medieval ones. Personal care was often communal. Someone brushed your hair, checked for insects, adjusted clothing. These quiet routines strengthened family relationships while accomplishing necessary work. Life moved slowly enough for such moments to exist, at least before harvest season arrived, and everyone forgot what sitting down felt like. Even then, the routines returned, because daily maintenance never truly ended. It simply paused long enough for more urgent problems to demand attention. As evening approached, smoke thickened again. Cooking fires burned. Candles flickered if the household could afford them. Rushlights provided cheaper illumination. Darkness settled quickly. People washed their hands, perhaps their face, maybe their feet if circumstances allowed. Outer clothing came off. Linen shifted or changed if another clean garment remained available. Then everyone climbed into beds that had hopefully been aired recently and hopefully contained fewer fleas than yesterday. Notice the word, hopefully. Optimism remained one of medieval Europe's most valuable renewable resources. Tomorrow would begin much the same way. Another bucket of water, another smoky fire, another attempt to keep order in a world where nature, weather, animals, and everyday life constantly pushed back. And despite everything, people adapted. Humans always do. The standards were different. The challenges were different. But beneath the smoke and mud lived ordinary families trying, as families always have, to make their homes just a little cleaner, a little warmer, and a little more comfortable than they had been the day before. And in its own quiet way, that's a surprisingly familiar story. If you ever looked at a medieval castle in a movie and thought, well, at least the rich people probably smelled nice. I'm afraid history has some wonderfully disappointing news. Castles looked magnificent from a distance. Tall towers, thick stone walls, colorful banners dancing in the wind, massive gates that practically announced, important people live here. But the moment you actually stepped inside, your nose would probably become the first casualty. Not because castles were neglected. Quite the opposite. Hundreds of servants worked every single day trying to keep these enormous buildings livable. The problem was that castles were never designed with modern comfort in mind. They were designed to survive a siege. Comfort came somewhere much farther down the list. Usually after, don't let the enemy in. Stone is an extraordinary building material if you're expecting catapults. It's considerably less impressive when you're trying to keep a room warm and dry. The walls absorbed moisture. The floor stayed cold. Tiny windows let in only limited sunlight. Even on bright days, many interior rooms remained dim. Candles helped. Fireplaces helped. Neither solved everything. Smoke drifted through hallways. Dampness lingered in corners. Heavy tapestries covered walls, partly because they looked impressive, but also because they trapped precious warmth. Those same tapestries collected dust with astonishing enthusiasm. Cleaning them wasn't exactly simple. You couldn't toss a 20-foot embroidered wall hanging into the washing machine, for reasons that would become obvious several centuries later. Instead, servants beat dust from fabrics outdoors whenever possible, brushed them, aired them, repeated the process. Dust always returned. Stone castles and dust developed a relationship that historians might politely describe as long-term. Now imagine heating one of these buildings. A great hall could be enormous, wonderful for feasts, less wonderful for staying warm. Fireplaces burned constantly during winter, would disappear at incredible speed. Even with roaring fires, heat rarely spread evenly. Sit close to the fireplace. You're pleasantly warm. Take 5 steps away. You're reconsidering every life choice that brought you there. Bedrooms often relied on heavy curtains surrounding the bed. These weren't merely decorative. They created smaller pockets of warm air around sleeping people. Without them, cold drafts wandered through the room whenever they pleased. And drafts always seem particularly enthusiastic at night. One almost imagines medieval castles secretly manufacturing cold air for entertainment. Then there were the floors. Most weren't covered wall to wall with luxurious carpets. Rushes, bundles of dried reeds or grasses, were frequently scattered across stone floors. Fresh rushes smelled pleasant. They softened footsteps, provided insulation, made large halls feel slightly more welcoming. It sounds rather clever, until you remember that they needed replacing. Frequently, old rushes trapped crumbs, mud, animal hair, spilled ale, dropped bits of food, everything that quietly worked its way downward over weeks or months. Good household management meant replacing them regularly. Poor management, well, let's simply say visitors probably noticed. Servants spent astonishing amounts of time sweeping, not because castles magically stayed clean, because they absolutely didn't. Every person entering tracked in dirt. Dogs wandered through halls. Horses waited in nearby courtyards. Falcons occasionally joined noble households. Yes, actual birds of prey. Impressive? Certainly. Neat and tidy? Not especially. Large households resembled small villages. The more people living together, the more cleaning became necessary. The medieval servants' work was endless. Someone fetched water. Someone scrubbed tables. Someone cleaned cooking pots. Someone carried ashes from fireplaces. Someone emptied chamber pots. Someone washed linens. Someone swept staircases. And by tomorrow morning, most of those jobs would need doing again. History often remembers kings. It should probably spend a little more time thanking servants. Without them, medieval castles would become uninhabitable remarkably quickly. Let's wander into the kitchen, perhaps not too close. Castle kitchens were astonishingly busy. Enormous fireplaces roasted meat. Huge cauldrons simmered for hours. Bread baked in massive ovens. Steam mixed with smoke. Grease-coated surfaces. Ash floated through the air. The kitchen staff worked in intense heat, while much of the castle remained cold. It was one of history's least balanced heating systems. Cleaning large iron pots required serious effort. Ash sometimes served as a scrubbing agent. Sand could also help remove stubborn food. Again, not elegant, but surprisingly effective. Modern dish soap remained comfortably far in the future. Human ingenuity filled the gap. Every meal generated leftovers. Bones, vegetable peelings, bread crusts grease. Waste management varied enormously depending on location and period. Some scraps fed animals. Some became compost. Some unfortunately ended up in places where future generations would greatly prefer they hadn't. Castle courtyards, therefore, required regular attention, especially during warm weather. Otherwise, nature quickly reminded everyone who was really in charge. Now let's talk about toilets, because no conversation about medieval hygiene can avoid them forever. The castle toilet often looked surprisingly sophisticated compared to the alternatives. Many castles featured garderobes, small toilet chambers built into the outer walls. Waste simply dropped through vertical shafts into pits below. Gravity handled the rest. Simple, reliable, mostly, unless the shaft became blocked. A possibility nobody enjoyed discussing. The smell depended on maintenance, weather, and whether the wind happened to cooperate that particular day. Sometimes everything functioned reasonably well. Sometimes opening the door became an act of quiet bravery. Castle builders often positioned garderobes, so prevailing winds carried unpleasant odors away from occupied rooms. An intelligent solution, unless the wind changed its mind. Nature remained wonderfully unpredictable. Cleaning these systems required specialized workers, not glamorous work, absolutely essential work. History contains countless occupations deserving more appreciation. This is unquestionably one of them. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist. People improvised. Moss, hay, soft leaves, pieces of cloth, wool, whatever local custom considered practical. Comfort varied dramatically. Let's simply leave it there. Some historical realities don't improve with excessive detail. Water for washing often arrived through wells or nearby springs. In particularly advanced castles, ingenious plumbing systems collected rainwater or directed fresh water where needed. Engineers accomplished impressive feats long before electricity existed. Unfortunately, even excellent engineering required maintenance. Pipes leaked, wells became contaminated. Winter froze everything. The medieval maintenance department never enjoyed a quiet season. Let's float gently upstairs into the private chambers of the nobility. These rooms certainly contain luxuries, beautiful furniture, painted chests, fine fabrics, silver mirrors, although their reflections weren't nearly as perfect as modern glass. Combs carved from bone or ivory, decorated wash basins, elegant pitchers. The wealthy absolutely valued personal appearance. Ladies brushed their hair carefully. Noblemen groomed beards according to fashion. Clean linen remained a status symbol. Expensive perfumes arrived through international trade. Some ingredients traveled astonishing distances. Spices, resins, essential oils. A tiny bottle might represent months of wages for an ordinary laborer. Perfume wasn't merely vanity. It also signaled wealth. If your clothing smelled faintly of imported roses, people noticed. They were meant to. Of course, perfume performed a difficult job. Imagine trying to compete against smoke from fireplaces, damp wool, leather boots, horses, hunting dogs, and several dozen people sharing enclosed spaces. One tiny bottle deserved admiration for simply trying. Noble women also cared deeply for their skin. Various creams and ointments promised beauty. Some recipes contained herbs. Others contained honey, milk, animal fats, plant oils. Many were harmless. A few probably worked reasonably well. Some sounded suspiciously optimistic. History has always enjoyed miracle beauty products. Apparently, that industry was invented very early. Hair washing happened, though not necessarily with commercial shampoo, for obvious reasons. People used herbal rinses, soap mixtures. Eggs occasionally appeared in recipes. Vinegar featured surprisingly often. Rosemary, sage, chamomile. Different regions favored different ingredients. Some treatments cleaned effectively. Others mainly smelled pleasant. Both outcomes were appreciated. Hair itself represented social status. Healthy, well-maintained hair suggested prosperity. Untidy hair suggested hardship. Unless fashion temporarily decided untidy looked sophisticated. Fashion has always possessed an unusual sense of humor. Now, let's meet another familiar resident of the castle. The flea. Despite everyone's best efforts, they remained astonishingly successful. Dogs carried them. Cats carried them. People carried them. Bedding welcomed them. Warm clothing delighted them. The medieval flea enjoyed perhaps the greatest real estate market in European history. People fought back continuously. Beds were aired, blankets shaken, mattresses exposed to sunlight, herbs tucked into bedding. None of these solutions completely eliminated the problem, but reducing fleas even slightly represented a meaningful victory. Every tiny success mattered. Lice inspired equally determined campaigns. Fine combs became treasured possessions. Personal grooming wasn't optional among the wealthy. It was expected. Servants often assisted. Long hair required patience. Patience required servants. Everyone contributed to maintaining appearances, because reputation mattered. A noble arriving at court covered in visible dirt would attract exactly the wrong kind of attention. The goal wasn't perfection. The goal was respectability. And respectability looked different in the 13th century than it does today. As evening approached, candles transformed the castle. Warm light flickered across stone walls. Shadows stretched between pillars. Musicians might perform quietly. Conversations softened. Servants carried warm water to private chambers. Not enough for luxurious daily baths, but sufficient for washing hands, face, and perhaps neck before bed. It felt civilized, comforting, orderly, within the limits of medieval technology. And perhaps that's the most important lesson. Castles weren't filthy because nobody cared. They were difficult to keep clean because they were enormous, crowded, smoky buildings built for defense rather than convenience. Their owners invested remarkable effort into cleanliness. They simply fought battles against cold stone, limited plumbing, endless smoke, determined insects, muddy boots, and the laws of physics. Some days they won. Other days, the castle smelled like several hundred people had spent the week living inside a giant fireplace, which, to be fair, was exactly what had happened. If you could somehow travel back to medieval Europe carrying a backpack filled with shampoo, body wash, toothpaste, deodorant, and a fluffy white towel, you would probably become one of the most confusing people anyone had ever met. Not because you owned soap. They knew what soap was. Not because you liked washing. Many medieval people appreciated being clean. The truly strange part would be how often you wanted to do it. A daily shower? That would seem wonderfully luxurious. Also slightly suspicious. Someone might eventually ask whether you had some unusual medical condition, or perhaps far too much free time, because heating enough water for a full bath every single day would have sounded almost absurd. Not impossible, just astonishingly impractical. Modern plumbing has quietly spoiled us. We turn a handle. Hot water appears. We rarely stop to admire this tiny miracle. A medieval household would have admired it for several hours. Every warm bath began with work. Someone had to fetch water. If the nearest well stood a short walk away, wonderful. If it was farther, that meant more trips. Each bucket weighed enough to remind you that gravity has always been deeply committed to its profession. Then the water had to be heated, would burn in the fire. Large pots simmered patiently. More water meant more wood. More wood meant more chopping, hauling, drying, and storing. Nothing about the process happened quickly. By the time enough warm water finally filled a wooden tub, half the household had probably contributed. Suddenly, that relaxing bath looked more like a community project, which explains why people didn't leap enthusiastically into one every evening. Instead, they developed routines that made practical sense. Daily washing usually meant smaller jobs. Hands, face, neck, sometimes feet. These were the parts other people actually saw. If you appeared clean where it mattered socially, you were generally considered respectable. The rest of the body, well, that could wait for a more convenient opportunity. Not ideal by modern standards. Entirely logical by medieval ones. Now, despite the stereotypes, public bathhouses remained surprisingly popular across much of medieval Europe for centuries, especially in towns and larger cities. In many places, visiting the bathhouse became a normal social activity. People met friends there, discussed business, relaxed after long days, shared news, complained about taxes. Apparently, that tradition has survived remarkably well. Some things truly never change. Bathhouses could range from simple wooden buildings to rather elaborate establishments. Warm rooms, steam, wooden tubs, attendants carrying fresh water, meals served afterward. Some even offer massages. It's beginning to sound less like the Middle Ages and more like an unexpectedly pleasant weekend. Of course, human beings have always possessed a remarkable ability to complicate pleasant things. Certain bathhouses gradually developed reputations that extended well beyond washing. Some attracted gambling, drinking, romantic encounters, and various activities that church authorities viewed with, let's call enthusiastic disapproval. Religious leaders weren't objecting because people became clean. They worried about what happened while people were becoming clean. History repeatedly demonstrates that wherever large groups gather to relax, someone eventually creates paperwork for the local authorities. As the centuries passed, opinions about bathing shifted. Medical theories evolved. Disease outbreaks changed public behavior. One of the most influential ideas involved the skin itself. Many physicians believed pores opened during hot baths. If dangerous air filled with illness surrounded you, open pores suddenly sounded like a terrible idea. According to their understanding, bathing too much might actually allow sickness easier access to body. Today we know bacteria, and viruses don't politely wait outside your pores requesting permission to enter. But medieval medicine worked from completely different assumptions. It wasn't irrational. It simply lacked the scientific discoveries that would arrive much later. This distinction matters. It's easy to laugh backward through history. Much harder to imagine making medical decisions without knowing germs exist. If every respected doctor agreed that excessive bathing weakened the body, you'd probably listen. Most people would knowledge always depends on what information is available. Let's drift into the medieval bathroom, which, strictly speaking, usually wasn't a separate room. A wealthy household might own a sturdy wooden bathing tub, sometimes lined with cloth, sometimes decorated. Servants carried bucket after bucket until the tub filled. The bather climbed inside. Warm water surrounded them. Perhaps herbs floated gently across the surface. Rosemary, lavender, chamomile, mint. These plants added pleasant fragrance. Some also possessed mild cleansing properties. Whether they transformed the experience into a luxury spa is perhaps optimistic, but they certainly improved morale. Soap accompanied some baths. Not every bath. Soap recipes varied enormously. Northern Europe often produced harder soaps made with animal fat and wood ash. Mediterranean regions favored olive oil. The quality differed. The texture differed. The smell definitely differed. Some soaps were surprisingly pleasant. Others seemed determined to remind everyone exactly how they had been made. Still, soap remained valuable. Its main job was wonderfully straightforward. Remove grease, loosen dirt, help people become cleaner. Mission accomplished. Eventually, hair presented its own challenges. Long hair absorbed smoke, dust, cooking odors. Outdoor life. Washing it required time and patience. Women with exceptionally long hair might spend hours drying and combing it afterward. Without electric hair dryers, this process depended entirely on towels, sunshine, warm rooms, and optimism. Mostly optimism. Various herbal rinses appeared throughout medieval recipe books. Rosemary promised healthy hair. Sage appeared frequently. Chamomile brightened lighter hair. Vinegar removed residue surprisingly well. Egg yolks occasionally enter the conversation. Some recipes sound remarkably sensible. Others sound suspiciously like someone simply emptied the kitchen cupboard into a bucket. Trial and error has always been an enthusiastic teacher. The wealthy often perfumed freshly washed hair afterward, not because they expected it to become dirty immediately, although that did happen. Instead, pleasant scents symbolized refinement. The smell of herbs followed someone through the hallways. People noticed. Social impressions mattered, even in the Middle Ages, perhaps especially in the Middle Ages. Now let's talk about hands, because hands received far more attention than popular myths suggest. People used them constantly, preparing food, eating, working, greeting guests, handling animals, writing, praying. Clean hands weren't merely desirable. They were practical. Noble households often provided basins before meals. Servants poured water over guests' hands. Elegant towels followed. This ritual combined hospitality with hygiene. It also quietly reminded everyone that dinner would soon involve touching food. Better to begin with reasonably clean fingers than enthusiastic optimism. Monasteries followed similar routines. Monks washed before communal meals. Rules emphasized order, discipline, moderation. Monastic life frequently appears surprisingly organized compared to the surrounding world. Not luxurious, just methodical, and methods often produce cleaner results. Children learn these habits early. Wash your hands. Comb your hair. Change your linen when possible. Keep your appearance respectable. Parents have been repeating versions of these instructions for countless generations. Some family traditions truly are timeless. Let's float gently into the world of medieval perfumes. Because if bathing happened less frequently than today, pleasant smells became rather important. Perfume wasn't always applied directly to the skin. Clothing received attention. Gloves, handkerchiefs, belts, even furniture. Small cloth pouches filled with fragrant herbs hung from belts or around the neck. Known in various forms across Europe, these scented bundles served practical and symbolic purposes. They smelled pleasant. People believed they purified the surrounding air. Again, remember the theory of miasma. If bad air caused illness, good smells became protective. Lavender wasn't merely relaxing. It was reassuring. Rose petals scented bedrooms. Frankincense drifted through churches. Rose water refreshed hands after meals. Mint freshened breath. Not perfectly, but every little improvement counted. And honestly, after spending all day near horses. Mint probably deserved a medal. The aristocracy sometimes imported exotic fragrances from distant lands. Trade routes connected Europe with the Middle East and beyond. Rare spices, ambergris, musk, resins. Each tiny bottle represented wealth, global commerce, and remarkable patience. Transporting delicate perfume across continents without modern packaging was no small achievement. Someone somewhere worked incredibly hard, so a duke could smell faintly of roses. History contains many unexpected career paths. Bathing etiquette also reflected social class. A noble family might own private tubs. A prosperous merchant visited bathhouses regularly. A peasant relied on rivers during warmer months. Simple washing indoors during winter, and opportunities whenever they appeared. No single medieval experience existed. Life differed enormously depending on wealth, region, occupation, and season. A fisherman living along the coast experienced cleanliness differently from a shepherd in the mountains. A queen lived differently from a blacksmith's wife. Generalizations only take us so far. Reality was wonderfully complicated. As night settled over towns and villages, the day's dust finally ended. People washed what they reasonably could. Hands, faces, sometimes feet sore from walking muddy roads. Fresh linen if fortune allowed. Perhaps a quick comb through the hair by candlelight. Then bed. Not perfectly clean. Not perfectly dirty. Simply as clean as circumstances made practical. And perhaps that's the quiet truth hidden beneath centuries of exaggeration. The Middle Ages were an era where people abandoned hygiene. They were an era where hygiene required enormous effort. Water had to be carried. Wood had to be chopped. Soap had to be made. Laundry took days. Warm baths consumed precious fuel. Every act of cleanliness represented time, labor, and resources. Today, we press a button. Yesterday, they organized an afternoon. Viewed from that perspective, their determination becomes far more impressive than their limitations. And in the warm glow of a single candle, with freshly washed hands, neatly combed hair, and a shirt that smelled faintly of lavender instead of smoke, a medieval person probably felt just as wonderfully clean as we do after stepping out of a modern shower. Different standards, different world, the same quiet satisfaction. If you woke up one morning in medieval Europe with a headache, your first thought probably wouldn't be, I should drink more water. Mostly because nobody had written that advice on the side of a reusable bottle yet. Instead, you might ask a local healer, visit a monastery, speak with a barber surgeon, or, if you were wealthy enough, summon a physician who had spent years studying ancient medical texts. The fascinating part? Many of these people were genuinely intelligent. They observed patients carefully, recorded symptoms, compared treatments, debated ideas. The problem wasn't a lack of effort. The problem was that they were missing one tiny but rather important piece of information: invisible microorganisms. Without germs, bacteria, or viruses in the picture, medieval medicine had to explain disease another way. And once you begin with the wrong explanation, even your smartest conclusions quietly wander in the wrong direction. One of the most influential medical ideas came from the ancient Greek physician Galen. His writings shaped European medicine for well over 1,000 years. According to this theory, the human body depended on the balance of 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Stay balanced, stay healthy, become unbalanced, become ill. It sounds unusual today, but remember, for centuries this wasn't considered a strange theory. It was considered the best medical science available. Physicians didn't randomly invent treatments. They followed respected traditions passed down through universities and manuscripts. That makes history much more interesting. People weren't wandering through villages making wild guesses every afternoon. They were applying what they sincerely believed to be evidence-based medicine. Evidence simply looked very different. If someone developed a fever, perhaps the body contained too much blood. If another patient appeared sluggish, maybe excess phlegm was responsible. Each illness reflected imbalance. The doctor's task became restoring harmony, rather like tuning a musical instrument, except the instrument occasionally complained quite loudly. This brings us, inevitably, to bloodletting. History's most famous medical habit. If you've ever heard someone joke, the medieval cure was to remove half your blood. They're exaggerating. Slightly. Bloodletting wasn't performed for absolutely everything, but it was astonishingly common. Doctors believed removing a controlled amount of blood could restore balance. Sometimes they used sharp blades. Sometimes specially designed lancets. Sometimes leeches. Yes, real leeches. Tiny aquatic creatures that somehow built one of the longest medical careers in history. To be fair, modern medicine still uses leeches in certain highly specialized surgical situations because they help improve blood circulation. The medieval explanation was wrong. The leech itself wasn't entirely useless. History occasionally enjoys these delightful little ironies. Imagine telling a 12th century physician, "You're mostly mistaken, but strangely enough, people will still use leeches 800 years from now." One suspects the conversation will become wonderfully confusing. Patients often accepted bloodletting calmly. It wasn't viewed as frightening. It was ordinary. Doctors chose favorable days according to medical calendars. Astrology occasionally entered the discussion. Certain zodiac signs supposedly affected different parts of the body. Medicine and astronomy frequently walked hand in hand. Science hadn't yet divided itself into neat modern categories. Everything belonged together. The heavens, the body, nature, religion, each helped explain the others. Whether those explanations prove correct is another matter entirely. Let's drift into the medieval pharmacy. You'll quickly notice something surprising. Many remedies actually came from plants. Monks cultivated herb gardens with extraordinary care. Lavender, sage, rosemary, mint, fennel, chamomile, yarrow. Thousands of years of observation had taught people that certain herbs genuinely eased discomfort. Chamomile soothed. Mint settled the stomach. Willow bark contained compounds related to what eventually became aspirin. No one understood the chemistry. They simply knew some treatments worked better than others. Experience can be an excellent teacher, even before laboratories arrive. Of course, not every remedy enjoyed the same success. Some recipes became ambitious, very ambitious. Ground gemstones appeared in expensive medicines. Powdered animal parts occasionally entered the conversation. Various mysterious ingredients promised miraculous recoveries. The medieval pharmaceutical industry clearly understood advertising long before newspapers existed. If something sounded rare enough, someone somewhere believed it must also be powerful. Human optimism has always been wonderfully profitable. Now let's talk about smell, because smell played an enormous role in medieval health. Remember the theory of miasma. Bad air caused disease. Therefore, pleasant air promoted health. Simple enough. Cities burned fragrant herbs. Churches filled with incense. Wealthy people carried scented pomanders, small decorative containers holding perfumes, spices, or aromatic substances. People occasionally lifted these little objects toward their noses while walking through crowded streets. Not because they disliked unpleasant odors. Well, also because of that, but mainly because they believed sweet smells protected them from illness. If plague drifted through foul air, lavender became a tiny invisible shield. It didn't actually stop plague, but emotionally, it probably offered comfort. And comfort has always possessed quiet value. Physicians also paid close attention to urine. Quite a lot of attention, actually. Examining its color, clarity, smell, and even taste occasionally formed part of diagnosis. Modern laboratory tests were unavailable. Doctors observed whatever information they could gather. Urine happened to provide many clues. Some conclusions proved surprisingly accurate. Others, less so, will politely avoid describing the tasting tradition in too much detail. Some historical facts deserve only a respectful nod from a safe distance. The medieval physicians certainly earned remarkable dedication points. Let's float over to another familiar figure, the barber surgeon. Perhaps history's greatest example of professional multitasking. Imagine walking into a shop intending to trim your beard. While waiting, someone nearby has a wound stitched. Another customer receives a tooth extraction. Someone else discusses headaches. Then your haircut begins. Modern salons generally avoid this business model. Barber surgeons occupied an important place in medieval society. University-trained physicians often focused on diagnosis. Barber surgeons handled practical procedures. They pulled teeth, set broken bones, drained abscesses, performed amputations when absolutely necessary. And yes, still cut hair. The famous red and white barber pole probably traces its origins to this unusual combination. The red represented blood. The white represented bandages. Not exactly the relaxing image modern marketing departments would choose. Yet, perfectly understandable for its time. Dental hygiene deserves another visit. People certainly appreciated healthy teeth. A bright smile looked attractive then just as it does now. Unfortunately, sugar slowly became more common among wealthy households. Not in today's astonishing quantities, but enough to create problems. Combined with limited dental care, toothaches flourished. Various powders attempted to clean teeth. Charcoal, salt, herbs, burnt bone. Different regions developed different recipes. Some probably removed stains effectively. Others likely removed enthusiasm as well. When a tooth became unbearable, extraction followed. No anesthetic, no cheerful music, no reassuring dentist explaining every step. Just determination, skill, and perhaps someone holding your shoulders. It's difficult not to admire medieval resilience. They endured experiences most modern people would happily postpone forever. Cleanliness also intersected with religion. Monasteries emphasized order. Regular washing before prayers or meals appeared in many communities. Physical cleanliness often carried symbolic meaning. Spiritual purity and bodily care frequently supported one another, not perfectly, not universally, but often enough to shape everyday habits. Pilgrims traveling long distances faced additional challenges. Weeks on muddy roads, changing weather, crowded inns, limited washing opportunities. Dust accumulated, boots deteriorated. Clothing absorbed everything the journey offered. Arriving at a monastery with fresh water probably felt unimaginably refreshing. Sometimes the greatest luxury isn't gold. It's a clean towel. Even kings occasionally became patients. Royal physicians occupied prestigious positions. Their successes earned favor. Their failures occasionally became political disasters. Imagine explaining to a monarch that your carefully balanced herbal treatment unfortunately hadn't prevented illness. Career advancement suddenly becomes rather uncertain. Despite all these limitations, it's important to remember something. Medieval medicine wasn't static. Doctors argued, observed, learned, copied better treatments, abandoned ineffective ones. Sometimes slowly, admittedly, knowledge expanded generation by generation. Hospitals attached to monasteries gradually improved care. Universities debated new ideas. Contact with scholars from the Islamic world introduced additional medical knowledge, translations, and techniques. Progress moved quietly, not dramatically. History rarely changes overnight. Instead, one observation became two. One manuscript inspired another. One physician questioned an older tradition. Centuries passed. Gradually, the foundations of modern medicine emerged. Not because medieval doctors knew everything, but because they kept asking questions, even when the answers remained frustratingly incomplete. As evening settled across a medieval town, someone somewhere still mixed herbs by candlelight. Another physician copied notes into a manuscript. A monk watered medicinal plants in the monastery garden. A worried mother brewed mint tea for a child with an upset stomach. A barber sharpened his razors for tomorrow's patients. None of them understood bacteria. None of them knew antibiotics would someday exist. Yet each was trying with sincere determination to reduce suffering using the knowledge available. Viewed through that gentle lens, the medieval world feels less like an age of ignorance and more like an age of unfinished discovery. They weren't standing at the end of medicine. They were standing somewhere near the beginning, taking slow, uncertain steps toward a future they could never imagine. For all the kings who wore crowns, for all the queens dressed in velvet, for all the knights covered in polished steel, the true rulers of medieval Europe may have been considerably smaller, small enough to fit beneath a collar, Small enough to hide inside a mattress. Small enough to disappear into a beard. Fleas, lice, bed bugs, mites. These tiny creatures had absolutely no respect for social class. They ignored wealth, ignored titles, ignored family trees stretching back to Charlemagne. A flea never paused to think, "Oh, this is a duke. I'd better show some manners." Quite the opposite. Everyone was equally interesting, and everyone, unfortunately, made an excellent meal. It's strangely comforting in a way. History reminds us that nature has always been wonderfully democratic. The richest person in the kingdom and the poorest laborer both spent time scratching. One simply scratched while wearing silk. Let's begin with perhaps the most famous medieval companion, the flea. If you've ever lived with dog or cat, you've probably encountered one. They're astonishing little athletes. A flea can jump many times its own body length. To humans, that's merely irritating. To the flea, it's an impressive engineering achievement. Medieval homes offered them nearly everything they wanted: warmth, animals, people, blankets, straw bedding, clothing, no modern insecticides, no vacuum cleaners, no washing machines running at high temperatures. From the flea's perspective, it was paradise. People certainly noticed them. No one simply accepted endless flea bites without attempting a solution. Beds were aired outside whenever weather permitted. Mattresses were beaten vigorously. Blankets hung in the sunshine. Fresh herbs were tucked beneath bedding. Lavender remained popular. So did wormwood, mint, rosemary. Some herbs genuinely discouraged insects for a while. Others mainly made the bedding smell nicer. Neither strategy entirely defeated determined fleas. Still, every small improvement mattered. If yesterday involved 100 flea bites and today involved only 80, that counted as progress. History occasionally sets very different standards for success. Now let's meet the louse. Unlike fleas, lice spend much of their lives directly on human bodies. Head lice especially flourished wherever people lived closely together. Families shared beds. Children played together. Travelers crowded into inns. Monasteries housed dozens or hundreds of monks. Castles gathered large households beneath one roof. Opportunities for lice traveled remarkably well. Again, this wasn't considered unusual. Finding lice didn't automatically suggest someone neglected personal care. Even individuals who washed regularly and combed their hair carefully could become infested. Modern schools still discover head lice from time to time. They're persistent little creatures. Medieval Europe simply had fewer tools for removing them. Fine-toothed combs became essential. Archaeologists have discovered beautifully carved combs made from bone, antler, wood, and ivory. Some are surprisingly elegant. Delicate patterns, intricate decorations, objects both practical and beautiful. Imagine spending hours carefully carving an elegant comb, only to use it removing lice. History possesses an extraordinary sense of irony. Combing often became a daily ritual. Parents checked children's hair. Servants groomed nobles. Husbands and wives sometimes helped each other. It was slow, patient work, oddly intimate by modern standards. Entirely ordinary then. One person sitting quietly while another searched carefully through their hair. The conversation probably wandered toward ordinary things. Tomorrow's weather, the harvest, family news, perhaps mild complaints about the neighbor's goat. Life continued. Even while someone searched for insects, let's float gently toward another unwelcome resident, the bedbug. Unlike fleas, bedbugs preferred remaining hidden during daylight. Cracks in wooden furniture, mattress seams, wall crevices. Then, night arrived. Out they came, hungry, determined, completely uninterested in whether tomorrow happened to be an important feast day. Medieval beds unintentionally created wonderful habitats. Wooden frames, straw mattresses, heavy curtains, warm sleeping bodies. Everything a bedbug could reasonably request. People fought back with persistence. Beds were dismantled, straw replaced, frames scrubbed. Heat from fireplaces sometimes helped. So did sunlight. Unfortunately, bed bugs possess remarkable patience. They can survive surprisingly long periods without feeding. Nature occasionally seems almost unfairly inventive. Sleeping, therefore, wasn't always a peaceful experience modern paintings suggest. A noble line beneath embroidered blankets might still wake scratching. A peasant sleeping on simple straw might do exactly the same. Luxury and discomfort frequently shared the same bedroom. Now let's wander into medieval wardrobes. Clothing represented an investment. Most people owned relatively few garments. Each shirt, each cloak, each pair of stockings required significant labor to produce. Throwing away clothes because of insects simply wasn't practical. Instead, people brushed garments vigorously, hung them outdoors, exposed them to fresh air, stored them with herbs. Cedar would help discourage some pests. Lavender offered pleasant fragrance. Wormwood earned a reputation for repelling insects. Whether insects agreed with these opinions varied considerably. Still, the effort never stopped. Laundry itself became another weapon. Boiling linen garments killed many unwanted guests. Unfortunately, will require gentler treatment. Different fabrics demanded different solutions. Households learned these lessons through long experience. No instruction manuals arrived with medieval clothing, only generations of accumulated knowledge. Let's drift toward one of history's most misunderstood accessories, the fur collar. Beautiful, warm, luxurious. Also, rather appealing to insects. Expensive furs required careful storage. Owners brushed them frequently, protected them with aromatic plants, inspected them regularly, because replacing a valuable fur cloak wasn't something done casually over the weekend. Moths also joined a medieval cast of tiny troublemakers. Stored textiles became tempting meals. Chests lined with fragrant woods or filled with dried herbs attempted to discourage them, sometimes successfully. Sometimes the moths interpreted these efforts as decorative suggestions. Nature remained stubbornly confident. Animals complicated everything further. Dogs slept indoors. Cats wandered wherever they pleased. Falcons occasionally perched inside noble residences. Horses occupied nearby stables. Every animal potentially carried its own collection of tiny passengers. The medieval household became a busy exchange program for insects, not intentionally, merely inevitably. One particularly clever cat might reduce the mouse population dramatically while simultaneously introducing several enthusiastic fleas. Life rarely provides completely free solutions. Speaking of mice, rodents represented another enormous concern, not merely because they chewed food supplies or damaged clothing, but because they attracted predators. Cats became cherished companions partly for this reason. A hard-working cat earned its place beside the fire, not through affection alone, though affection certainly followed. Employment came first, friendship later. It's a surprisingly modern arrangement. Now, let's visit a monastery. Surely you might imagine disciplined religious communities escape some of these problems. Not entirely. Monasteries emphasize cleanliness more consistently than many other institutions. Regular washing, orderly routines, neatly maintained dormitories, rules regarding bedding and clothing. Even so, monks remained human. Shared sleeping quarters encouraged the same tiny visitors found elsewhere. The difference lay mainly in organization, routine inspection, routine cleaning, routine laundry. Discipline rarely eliminated insects completely. It merely reduced opportunities. Discipline has always been quietly powerful, even against fleas. Medical writers occasionally offered advice about parasites. Certain ointments promised relief. Herbal washes, strong-smelling oils, mercury-based treatments even appeared from time to time. Today we know mercury creates rather more problems than it solves. At the time, people experimented with whatever seemed promising. Medicine remained a long conversation rather than a finished science. Occasionally they stumbled onto useful ideas. Occasionally not. Travel spread insects with remarkable efficiency. Pilgrims visited holy sites. Merchants crossed continents. Armies marched hundreds of miles. Students attended distant universities. Everyone carried luggage, clothing, blankets, perhaps one or two unexpected hitchhikers. Long before airplanes connected the world, People already manage to transport tiny creatures across astonishing distances. The insects certainly appreciated international trade. Even if historians rarely mention their contribution, let's pause for a quiet thought. Modern people often imagine cleanliness as a destination. You shower, you become clean, the task is finished. Medieval cleanliness worked differently. It resembled gardening, something requiring constant attention. Comb today, sweep tomorrow, wash linen next week, replace straw next month, air blankets whenever sunshine appeared. Nothing stayed clean by itself. Every improvement slowly faded. Then the work began again. That rhythm shaped everyday life. Not dramatic, not glamorous, simply continuous. Children learned it naturally. Adults accepted it. Old age carried the habits forward, generation after generation. As darkness settled across another medieval evening, someone somewhere gently shook a blanket beneath the fading light. Another carefully combed a child's hair. A servant replaced worn straw in a mattress. A grandmother tucked lavender into a wooden chest. None of these actions promised perfection. They promised something much more realistic. A slightly better tomorrow than yesterday. Sometimes that's all history has ever offered. And perhaps that's enough. Because despite every flea, every louse, every stubborn bedbug hiding deep within an ancient wooden bed, people still slept, still dreamed, still woke with hope for another ordinary day, even if they occasionally woke scratching first. If the medieval countryside smelled like earth, smoke, and farm animals, the medieval cities smelled like absolutely everything. At once. Imagine standing just inside the city gates shortly after sunrise. Merchants are already arriving with carts full of vegetables. A blacksmith has begun heating iron. The baker has pulled the first loaves from the oven. Fish sellers are loudly insisting their catch is fresher than the stall next door. Someone is driving sheep through the street. Someone else is arguing over the price of onions. A horse decides this exact moment is the perfect time to remind everyone that horses have digestive systems. Nearby, a church bell begins ringing. Children race between adults. Dogs investigate absolutely everything. The city is awake, and so are all of its smells. To us, it would probably seem overwhelming. To the people living there, it simply smelled like home. One of the most surprising things about medieval cities is that they weren't built to hold a number of people who eventually crowded inside them. Many towns had grown slowly over centuries. Narrow streets that worked perfectly well for a few thousand residents suddenly struggled with many more. Houses leaned toward one another. Upper floors often projected over the street below. In some places, neighbors could practically shake hands from opposite windows. Convenient for conversation. Less convenient for sunlight. With buildings packed so closely together, fresh air moved more slowly. Smoke lingered. Cooking odors drifted through entire neighborhoods. The smell of leather from the tanner's workshop mixed with fresh bread from the bakery. Nearby, the brewer boiled grain. Not far away, a stable housed dozens of horses. It wasn't one unpleasant smell. It was hundreds of ordinary smells layered together. Every profession added something to the atmosphere. The baker contributed warmth and fresh bread. The blacksmith added smoke and hot metal. The butcher introduced rather stronger aromas. The fishmonger. Well, everyone knew exactly where the fishmonger worked long before they reached the stall, especially during summer. Markets became particularly lively on busy trading days. People traveled from surrounding villages carrying eggs, butter, vegetables, fruit, cheese, grain, cloth, and livestock. Every street seemed alive with movement. Officials attempted to organize this wonderful chaos. Different trades often occupied different areas. Butchers gathered together. Leather workers clustered nearby. Goldsmiths preferred cleaner surroundings. This organization wasn't merely convenient. It helped control some of the inevitable mess. Keyword, some. Waste disposal presented constant challenges. Most cities established rules. Residents weren't supposed to dump garbage wherever they pleased. Animal remains belonged in designated places. Street cleaning took place regularly in many towns. Fines existed for breaking sanitation rules, which tells us something important. Authorities cared. If nobody cared about cleanliness, There would be no rules. The existence of regulations proves medieval governments understood dirty streets created real problems. Enforcing those rules, however, that proved considerably more difficult. Human beings have always possessed an astonishing ability to believe. Surely my little pile of rubbish won't matter. Multiply that idea by several thousand households, and suddenly city officials develop permanent headaches. Some towns hired workers specifically to remove waste. Carts carried refuse beyond the walls. Scavengers collected materials worth recycling. Animal dung sometimes became fertilizer for nearby farms. Even rubbish possessed economic value. Very little when completely unused. People were practical. If something still had a purpose, someone usually found it. Now let's talk about the gutters. Not the tidy metal ones attached to modern roofs. Street gutters. Many medieval roads sloped gently toward shallow channels running along the sides or center. Rainwater flowed through them. Ideally, in practice, they also carried everything else that found its way there. After heavy rain, streets sometimes cleaned themselves surprisingly well. Nature provided a generous rinse. During dry weather, the situation became rather less refreshing. People quickly learned where they preferred not to step. Visitors learned slightly more slowly. The city's footwear industry quietly appreciated repeat customers. Let's float toward perhaps the least glamorous profession in town, the gong farmer. History occasionally invents job titles that require absolutely no further explanation. Gong farmers emptied cesspits, usually at night. They removed human waste from pits beneath privies and transported it outside the city. It was difficult, dangerous, unpleasant work. It was also completely essential. Without these workers, urban life would have become impossible. Yet they rarely appear in paintings. Kings receive portraits. Gong farmers receive grateful silence. History can be unfair like that. The work often happened after dark because quieter streets made transportation easier. Fewer witnesses probably improve morale as well. Some professions simply don't benefit from enthusiastic public attention. Nevertheless, entire cities depend upon them. Water remained precious. Public wells serve neighborhoods. Some cities build impressive conduits bringing fresh water from springs outside the walls. Engineers displayed remarkable ingenuity. Wooden pipes, stone channels, storage cisterns. The technology could be surprisingly sophisticated. Maintenance, however, never ended. A blocked pipe affected everyone. A contaminated well threatened entire districts. Communities therefore watched their water sources carefully, at least whenever they understood the danger. Remember, they didn't know about bacteria. They simply knew certain wells sometimes made people ill. Observation often came long before explanation. Breweries played an unexpectedly important role in urban life. Beer wasn't merely an enjoyable drink. It was frequently safer than questionable water supplies because the brewing process involved boiling. Small beer, containing relatively little alcohol, appeared regularly at meals. Children drank it. Workers drank it. Travelers drank it. Not because medieval Europe spent every afternoon slightly tipsy, but because brewing reduced certain risks hidden inside untreated water. Again, people didn't understand microbes. They understood experience. Experience repeatedly whispered, "This drink usually causes fewer problems." Experience can become an excellent scientist, even without microscopes. Let's wander into a medieval inn. Travelers arrived dusty. Merchants unloaded goods. Pilgrims rested tired feet. Horses occupied nearby stables. Meals simmered over open fires. Shared sleeping rooms welcomed complete strangers. Privacy remained an expensive luxury. One large room might contain numerous beds. Sometimes several people shared each one. Blankets were reused. Mattresses endured years of service. The innkeeper certainly tried to provide comfort. Perfect hygiene remained rather beyond the available technology. Travel itself encouraged the movement of insects, illnesses, and stories. Merchants exchanged news alongside goods. Pilgrims carried tales from distant shrines. Students returned from universities with fresh ideas. Cities became crossroads for knowledge. And everything else. Even fashion traveled. A new style of hat appearing in Paris might gradually reach London. A clever soap recipe developed in Italy eventually found admirers farther north. Trade carried more than spices. It carried habits, some excellent, some less so. Now, let's pause beside the river. Many medieval cities grew alongside waterways. Rivers supplied drinking water, powered mills, supported trade, provided fish. They also received waste. Industrial workshops used them extensively. Tanners soaked hides. Dyers colored cloth. Fullers cleaned wool. Each industry relied on water. Each left something behind. No one intentionally tried to destroy the river. They simply lacked better alternatives. Cities expanded faster than sanitation systems evolved. It's a familiar pattern throughout history. Technology solves one problem. Population creates another. Then innovation begins again. Despite all these challenges, urban life attracted people constantly. Opportunity outweighed inconvenience. Cities offered markets, employment, education, protection behind walls, religious centers, entertainment, community. If medieval cities were truly unbearable, people would have abandoned them. Instead, they kept arriving, generation after generation. That tells us something valuable. The smells, noise, and crowds form part of a larger picture, a picture filled with possibility. As evening approached, shopkeepers swept the fronts of their stores. Street cleaners made their rounds. Market stalls closed. Church bells echoed across rooftops. Smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys preparing the evening meal. The city slowly softened, not into silence. Cities never truly become silent, but into something calmer. Candles glowed behind wooden shutters. Families gathered indoors. Doors closed against the night. Tomorrow morning the streets would awaken once more. The baker would light his oven. The blacksmith his forge. The merchant his stall. The gong farmer would quietly finish another shift that nobody wished to discuss. And the great medieval city would continue doing exactly what cities have always done. Growing, changing, adapting. One ordinary, wonderfully complicated day at a time. If medieval paintings are to be believed, royal life was an endless parade of polished crowns, shimmering robes, spotless halls, and people who somehow look majestic even while standing completely still. Paintings, however, have always been wonderfully selective. They rarely include the servant carrying a chamber pot, or the nobleman quietly scratching at a flea bite during an important meeting, or the queen asking whether anyone had remembered to heat enough water for a bath. History likes to preserve dignity. Real life usually has other ideas. For all their power, Europe's kings and queens remained ordinary human beings in one important respect. They still woke up every morning inside a body that required constant care. Hair grew, teeth needed cleaning, clothing became dirty, skin became oily, and absolutely no royal decree could convince a bedbug to respect the monarchy. The royal household therefore revolved around routines that were both luxurious and surprisingly practical. Long before a king appeared in public, servants had already begun preparing for the day. Fresh linen waited nearby. Warm water was carried into private chambers. Combs, mirrors, towels, and scented cloths were carefully arranged. Dressing a monarch wasn't a quick task. It could involve several attendants. One managed clothing. Another handled jewelry. Another prepared perfumes. Everything followed ceremony. Even getting dressed could become a small performance. Not because the king couldn't dress himself, but because ceremony itself projected authority. Power was meant to look effortless. Even when 20 people quietly helped create the illusion, the first layer touching the skin was usually linen, soft compared with rougher wool, more comfortable, much easier to wash. The linen shirt quietly performed one of the most important hygienic jobs in medieval Europe. It absorbed sweat, collected oils, protected expensive outer garments. When nobles changed into fresh linen, they genuinely became cleaner. This wasn't merely appearance. It was practical hygiene. Outer robes, meanwhile, might cost extraordinary amounts of money. Silk imported across continents. Velvet woven by skilled craftsmen. Fine embroidery completed over months. Nobody wanted to scrub those garments every few days. Doing so risked damaging the fabric. Instead, they were brushed, aired, spot clean when necessary, stored carefully inside carved wooden chests. The linen underneath carried much of the daily burden. It's a remarkably sensible system once you understand it. Expensive clothing lasted longer. The body remained reasonably comfortable. Everyone benefited. Well, except perhaps the servant responsible for endless laundry. Royal laundries worked almost continuously. Large households generated astonishing amounts of linen, tablecloths, napkins, bed sheets, undergarments, towels. Everything required washing, without electricity, without detergents, without automatic washing machines humming quietly in the corner. Water was heated in enormous cauldrons. Soap mixed by hand. Clothes scrubbed vigorously. Rinsed. Hung outdoors whenever weather cooperated. Rain, naturally, enjoyed interrupting these plans. The medieval sky had little respect for laundry schedules. Let's drift toward the royal bedroom. Contrary to modern imagination, the royal bed wasn't simply a place for sleeping. It represented status, political authority, dynastic continuity. Visitors occasionally entered these chambers on official business. Servants came and went throughout the day. Doctors examined patients there. Courtiers delivered news. Privacy existed, but not in quite the way we think of it today. The bed itself often stood high above the floor. Heavy curtains surrounded it. Mattresses layered feathers, wool, or straw depending on wealth and circumstance. Blankets piled generously during winter. It looked wonderfully comfortable, until history quietly reminds us. Fleas also appreciated feather mattresses. Bed bugs admired carved wooden frames. Luxury and inconvenience continued their centuries-long partnership. Servants aired bedding regularly. Sheets changed when possible. Mattresses beaten. Curtains shaken free of dust. The work never ended. Imagine maintaining an enormous royal bedroom while dozens of people entered every day carrying dust on their boots. Cleaning became less an event and more of a permanent occupation. Now let's visit the royal dining table. Magnificent feasts appear constantly in medieval stories. Long tables, roasted swans, massive joints of beef, brightly colored desserts, silver goblets, golden plates, musicians playing softly nearby. All wonderfully impressive. Before any of that began, hands were washed. This wasn't optional among polite society. Servants approached carrying elegant basins and pitchers. Warm water flowed over each guest's hands. Clean towels followed. The ritual demonstrated refinement. It also reduced the amount of dirt reaching dinner. People noticed good manners. A noble who ignored the washing basin risked appearing uncivilized, which is rather ironic considering they were all about to eat roasted meat with their fingers. History enjoys these charming little contradictions. Table etiquette extended beyond washing. Guests avoided wiping greasy hands directly onto expensive clothing. Bread sometimes doubled as a practical tool for gathering sauces. Knives appeared everywhere. Forks spread slowly across Europe. Their adoption wasn't immediate. Many people initially regarded them with mild suspicion. Apparently introducing a new eating utensil can become surprisingly controversial. Human beings have always been wonderfully adaptable. Eventually, let's float quietly into the queen's private chamber. Medieval queens often maintained collections of cosmetics, not dramatic theatrical makeup, subtle preparations, skin creams, herbal lotions, rose water, perfumed oils. Many recipes survive in manuscripts. Some relied on honey, others on almond oil. Milk occasionally appeared. Beeswax formed protective balms. These weren't merely attempts at beauty. Healthy skin represented status. A pale complexion suggested freedom from outdoor labor. Soft hands implied servants handled difficult work. Appearance communicated social position before anyone spoke a word. Hair demanded equal attention. Ladies of the court brushed it carefully, sometimes for astonishing lengths of time. Long hair tangled easily. Smoke from fireplaces clung stubbornly. Perfumed powders freshened wigs and hairpieces in later centuries, but medieval women relied mainly on herbs, oils, and patient grooming. Combs became treasured possessions, beautifully carved, sometimes inherited across generations. Hair itself carried symbolic meaning. covered after marriage in many regions, displayed differently according to age, status, or religious custom. Fashion quietly reflected social expectations. Kings also maintained their appearance. Beards came and went according to changing styles. Some rulers preferred clean-shaven faces. Others cultivated impressive facial hair. Royal barbers became trusted members of the household. Imagine spending years holding sharp razors against the king's throat every morning. Trust suddenly acquires a rather literal meaning. Those same barbers often trimmed hair, treated minor wounds, and occasionally offered medical advice. Professional boundaries remained pleasantly flexible. Now let's consider royal travel. Castles weren't permanent homes. Kings traveled constantly, inspecting lands, meeting nobles, holding courts, leading military campaigns, visiting monasteries. Every journey disrupted comfortable routines. Temporary accommodations varied enormously. Some castles offered excellent facilities. Others, less so. Servants carried personal belongings from place to place. Portable wash basins, linen, perfumes, combs, everything required to recreate a small piece of royal comfort wherever the court happened to stop. Moving an entire royal household resembled relocating a small town. Hundreds of people, countless horses, wagons loaded with furniture, kitchen equipment, clothing, books, chapel furnishings. Even luxury traveled slowly. Dust accompanied everyone. Rain certainly didn't help. Neither did muddy roads. By the end of the long journey, even the finest velvet cloak looked rather less magnificent than when it departed. Fortunately, the royal laundry department remained employed. Physicians visited the royal family frequently. They advised moderation in eating, recommended fresh air, prepared herbal medicines, suggested appropriate bathing according to contemporary medical theory. Sometimes they advised against excessive bathing. Sometimes they encouraged gentle washing. Opinions shifted with circumstance. Medical certainty has always been slightly more complicated than we like. The king generally listened, at least until another physician offered entirely different advice. Experts disagreeing with one another is hardly a modern invention. Religion also shaped royal hygiene. Special feast days, periods of fasting, pilgrimages, ceremonial washing before important religious events. Cleanliness sometimes carried spiritual significance as well as physical meaning. Body and soul frequently appeared connected, not always in ways modern science would recognize, but deeply meaningful to medieval believers. Perhaps the greatest surprise is how familiar many royal routines actually feel. Brush your hair, wash your hands, change into fresh clothing, air the bedroom, clean the dining table, sweep the floor, replace worn bedding, light pleasant-smelling herbs, open the windows when weather allows. These are hardly exotic ideas. The tools differed. The technology differed. The goals remained remarkably recognizable. Comfort, health, respectability, a pleasant home. Exactly what people still hope for today. As another evening settled over the castle, servants quietly extinguished candles one by one. Fresh linen waited for tomorrow. Warm water cooled inside empty basins. The king removed heavy ceremonial robes with considerable relief. The queen unpinned elaborate hairstyles that had required hours to arrange. Somewhere down the corridor, another servant beat dust from a carpet. Another folded blankets. Another swept the hall. Before sunrise would begin everything once again. The crown glittered brilliantly beneath candlelight, but underneath the gold, jewels, and velvet lived ordinary people doing their best to stay comfortable in an extraordinary age. And perhaps that is the most human thing about medieval royalty. For all their immense power, they still appreciated the simple luxury of clean hands, fresh linen, and a warm bowl of water at the end of a very long day. As our quiet walk through medieval Europe begins to slow, it's worth pausing for a moment, not in a grand cathedral, not in a royal throne room, but beside a small wooden wash basin, sitting near a flickering candle. Inside it rests a little warm water, a simple linen cloth, perhaps a small piece of handmade soap, maybe a few sprigs of rosemary floating gently on the surface. Nothing here looks especially remarkable, and yet This humble bowl quietly tells the entire story of medieval hygiene. Because the Middle Ages were never really about choosing between being clean or dirty. They were about doing the very best you could with the world you happened to inherit. That world had no indoor plumbing, no electric water heaters, no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria, no deodorant quietly waiting in the bathroom cabinet, no toothpaste promising extra whitening, no washing machines finishing an hour later with a cheerful little song. Every single act of cleanliness demanded effort, sometimes enormous effort. Every bucket of water had to be carried. Every fire had to be lit. Every towel had to be washed by hand. Every bar of soap had to be made from scratch. When viewed through modern eyes, medieval hygiene often seems primitive. Viewed through medieval eyes, it was simply daily life. And perhaps that's the most important lesson history quietly offers us. The people of the Middle Ages did not wake each morning thinking, "Today I shall live in filth." Quite the opposite. They swept their homes, washed their hands, changed their linen, combed their hair, trimmed their beards, cleaned their cooking pots, aired their bedding, scrubbed their tables, fed their animals, carried away rubbish, repaired roofs, maintained wells, built drains, established public rules for sanitation. They invested astonishing amounts of time simply trying to keep disorder under control. Nature just happened to be very good at creating more of it. If you ever cleaned your kitchen only to discover crumbs appearing almost immediately afterward, you already understand the medieval experience. Imagine doing that without running water, without disinfectant, without rubber gloves, without a vacuum cleaner. Suddenly, their accomplishments begin to look rather impressive. One of history's greatest misunderstandings comes from imagining progress as a straight line, as though one century was dirty, then another century suddenly became clean. Reality rarely behaves so neatly. Ancient Rome possessed magnificent bathhouses. Some medieval towns continued those traditions. Others lost them. The Renaissance introduced fresh ideas. The early modern period embraced perfume in astonishing quantities. The 18th century sometimes preferred changing linen over frequent bathing. The 19th century slowly accepted germ theory. The 20th century brought antibiotics, modern plumbing, chlorinated water, widespread soap production, and public sanitation on a scale earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Every age solved certain problems. Every age created new ones. History doesn't move in straight lines. It meanders, sometimes confidently, sometimes rather awkwardly, rather like someone crossing a muddy medieval street. Let's float back for a moment to the ordinary people we've met along the way. The peasant rising before sunrise, sweeping yesterday's ashes from a hearth, fetching fresh water before breakfast, the merchant carefully brushing expensive wool cloaks, the monk washing his hands before entering the refectory, the castle servant changing damp rushes covering the floor, the queen arranging fragrant lavender inside carved wooden chests, the physician carefully examining a patient while sincerely believing he understood how illness worked, the barber sharpening both his razor and his surgical knife, the gong farmer quietly disappearing into the darkness before dawn, performing one of the least celebrated but most essential jobs in the entire city. None of them imagined themselves as historical figures. None expected people hundreds of years later to debate how often they bathed. They simply lived. That's one of history's quietest truths. The people we study never realized they were becoming history. They were simply trying to finish another ordinary Wednesday. Children still laughed. Parents still worried. Neighbors still borrowed tools. Young couples still fell in love. Old people still complained about cold winters. Markets still opened at sunrise. Church bells still echoed across rooftops. Cats still ignored everyone. Some traditions truly are eternal. Now consider something surprisingly comforting. Your morning routine probably includes several inventions created through thousands of years of accumulated experience. You brush your teeth because generations slowly discovered what protected them. You wash your hands because science eventually uncovered invisible organisms. You drink clean water because engineers, doctors, lawmakers, and countless workers transformed public health over centuries. You probably complete your entire morning routine faster than a medieval family could prepare enough warm water for one bath. That's an extraordinary privilege, one so ordinary that most of us rarely notice it. History has a gentle way of reminding us not to feel superior, but to feel grateful. Even our homes quietly reveal centuries of progress. A toilet that disappears waste with the press of a handle. A sink delivering hot and cold water whenever requested. Soap costing less than a loaf of bread. Fresh towels dried overnight. Clean clothes waiting in a wardrobe free from moths because someone invented sealed closets, insect control, and synthetic fabrics. None of these conveniences appeared overnight. Each represents generations of trial, failure, observation, curiosity, and relentless improvement. The medieval world deserves more credit than it usually receives. People observed patterns, recorded recipes, built aqueducts, maintained wells, developed soaps, cultivated medicinal herbs, organized waste removal, established bathing customs, created hospitals, founded universities, preserved ancient medical texts, translated foreign knowledge, experimented, argued, learned, sometimes slowly, sometimes frustratingly, but always moving. Human civilization rarely sprints. It walks, one careful step after another. Of course, some medieval beliefs seem wonderfully strange today. The idea that bad smells themselves cause disease. The fear that hot baths open dangerous pores. Medical astrology, bloodletting, protective perfumes against plague. Yet before we smile too confidently, it's worth remembering that future generations may someday look back at some of our own habits with equal amusement. History encourages humility. Every age believes it understands the world remarkably well. Every age eventually discovers there was still much left to learn. Perhaps 800 years from now, someone will quietly narrate. People in the 21st century actually believed, and listeners will smile gently before falling asleep. That thought alone should keep all of us modest. As the evening deepens, our medieval village grows quiet. Smoke rises lazily through the cool night air. Dogs curl beside warm hearths. The last lanterns fade behind wooden shutters. Somewhere a monk finishes copying another page by candlelight. A castle servant hangs freshly washed linen to dry before morning. A mother gently combs her daughter's hair. A father checks the fire one last time. An old woman places dried lavender into a chest beside carefully folded clothing. A traveler finally reaches an inn after a week on muddy roads and gratefully washes his face before climbing into bed. None of these moments will appear in history books. Yet together, they are history. Not the battles, not the coronations, not the famous names carved into monuments, but the quiet routines repeated millions upon millions of times. The ordinary acts that kept civilization alive. A clean bowl, a swept floor, fresh water, a warm fire, a comb, a bar of soap, a linen shirt drying in the evening breeze. These humble objects carried civilizations forward just as surely as castles and kings. Perhaps even more so, because empires rise, empires fall, dynasties disappear. But tomorrow morning, someone will still need to wash their hands. And in that simple truth, the medieval world suddenly doesn't feel so distant after all. Our journey through smoky cottages, crowded streets, echoing castles, bustling markets, fragrant herb gardens, noisy bathhouses, royal chambers, monastery cloisters, and muddy roads finally comes to a peaceful close. Thank you for wandering through the surprisingly human corner of history. May your own bed be free of fleas. May your shower always have hot water. And may you never have to organize an entire household simply to enjoy a warm bath. Sleep well. The story is end.